with artist and writer Justin Beal and architect Kulapat Yantrasast. And they're here to talk about American architectural experimentation, utopianism, the architect Minoru Yamasaki, and Justin Beal's new book, Sandfuture. Justin Beal is an architect and writer. Sorry, he's not an architect. He could have been an architect, though. He is an artist and writer and teaches at Hunter College in New York. He graduated from Yale University with a degree in architecture and then participated in the Whitney Independent Study Program and went on to receive an MFA from USC. His work has been shown at the Esther Schipper Gallery in Berlin and the Modern Institute in Glasgow, as well as the Bortolami, Casey Kaplan, and Tanya Bonakdar galleries, and at the Sculpture Center in New York. And he's also shown here in LA at Acme, Night Gallery, LAX Art, and Blum and Poe. And in 2017, he curated the exhibition Touch Piece at the Hannah Hoffman Gallery in Los Angeles. His work is included in the permanent collections at the Albright Knox Museum, MoCA, and right here at the Hammer Museum. Sandfuture, published by MIT Press in September, is his first book. It covers the life and career of Minoru Yamasaki, who designed the original World Trade Center and yet remains on the margins of history despite the enormous influence of his work on U.S. architecture and society. Sandfuture is also a very personal book in which Beal contemplates the question of how and for whom architectural history is written. It's a book about an artist interrogating art and architecture's role in culture. From the central thread of Yamasaki's life, Beal's narrative spirals outward to include reflections on a wide range of subjects, from the figure of the architect in literature and film to broader social and political implications of how and for whom our cities are built. Rem Koolhaas called the book a daring literary construct, and Edwin Heathcote wrote in the Financial Times that Sandfuture is, quote, not like any other book on architecture that I have read, and that's a very good thing. It's a brilliant and often surprisingly personal book that works as metaphor and perhaps also as portent. So we're going to hear all about Minoru Yamasaki and the book Sandfuture from Justin Beal, and then he'll be joined on stage by Kulapat Yantrasast for what I imagine will be a very fruitful conversation. Kulapat Yantrasast is a thought leader in the fields of architecture, art, and sustainable design. He's originally from Thailand and is now based in Los Angeles and New York, where he's the founding partner and creative director of Y, a multidisciplinary design practice. In 2007, Yantrasast led the design for the Grand Rapids Art Museum, which was the first art museum building in the world to receive the LEED Gold certification for environmentally sustainable design. Since then, Y has engaged in major museum projects, including the Rockefeller Wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Northwest Coast Hall at the American Museum of Natural History. Other leading cultural projects include the Ross Pavilion in Scotland, the Tchaikovsky Opera Theater in Russia, and the expansion of the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, as well as the new Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles. In 2009, Yantrasast was the first architect to receive the Silpathorne Award for Design from Thailand's Ministry of Culture for outstanding achievement and notable contributions to Thai contemporary arts and culture. And for the past 2 years, Kulapat has served on the Hammer Museum's Artist Council, which engages with our leadership on conceptual designs, conceptual questions facing contemporary art museums today. Tonight's conversation will be followed by a little reception where we have coffee, tea, and cookies for everyone, and we'll have copies of the book Sandfuture for sale, and hopefully Justin will sign some copies for us. Just a quick note before we begin. This is only the third or fourth public program that we've been able to have here at the Hammer Museum since the pandemic shut down in March 2020. And I'm really just so happy to be here with all of you in community. I think it's so important for us humans to be together at events like this with real people in person. But in order to do this safely, we all need to do our part to keep our community safe. So I want to remind you that we all need to keep your masks on throughout the program, and I mean all the way on over the nose. And I want to thank you personally for doing this, even though we all know it's uncomfortable. But we have immunocompromised people here, and it's really important to make this a safe and inclusive environment for everyone. So I have asked our guest speakers to only take off their mask while they're speaking, but the audience, it's really important that we keep our masks on, please. So now, without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Justin Beal.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Claudia, for the introduction, and Carla for your help with logistics, and Kulapat for being here and talking about the book with me. As Claudia explained, we're going to have a conversation, but at the beginning, I just wanted to quickly talk a bit about the book for those of you who haven't read it or not familiar with it. So I'm going to show some slides, and then we'll jump into the conversation. This is the book, Sandfuture. It is, though I don't really think of myself as a writer of biography or of memoir, it's a book that's one half biography and one half memoir. The biography is about this man, Minoru Yamasaki, who is an American architect who is probably best known for his work designing the Pruitt-Igoe apartments in St. Louis and the World Trade Center in New York, both of which are respectively probably best known for being demolished in spectacular fashion on television before cameras. Pruitt-Igoe first in the summer of 1972. This is a photograph from Life magazine. And of course, the World Trade Center in 2001. This is a photograph that I took on the morning of September 11th. But one of the complicated things about Yamasaki is that though he's best known for those two projects, they are also probably the two things that are the least representative of a much more diverse and prolific practice, which includes a number of projects I'm going to run through. The first is the Eastern Airlines terminal at Logan Airport in Boston, which some of you will recognize. It's no longer there, but it was a very important building for me growing up in Massachusetts because it looked so much different than every other building in Boston. Also, the Lambert Air Terminal in St. Louis, which was the first major success of Yama's career. The McGregor Memorial Conference Center at Wayne State University in Detroit. The Reynolds Metal Regional Headquarters outside of Detroit in Southfield. The Seattle Pavilion, the Science Pavilion in Seattle for the Seattle World's Fair, which was a very important project in his career and led directly to the commission to design the World Trade Center, which landed him on the cover of Time magazine in 1963, which, as many of you know, is quite a rare honor for an architect, and sort of indicative of the apex of a long career. From there, he went on to design the World Trade Center. These are two photographs by Baltazar Korab, who was a good friend, neighbor of Yama's. The Robertson Hall at Princeton University, formerly known as Woodrow Wilson, which is still there, unlike many of Yamasaki's buildings. The Dhahran International Airfield, which is a lesser-known project of his that King Saud described as the most Saudi Arabian building that he had ever seen at the time, and was remained on currency in Saudi Arabia for 15 to 20 years. And three major buildings, or two depending on how you count them here in Century City, the Century Plaza Towers and the Century Plaza Hotel. And then this is a building from late in his career in Seattle, the Rainier Tower. But the book is also something else entirely, and it's a story about a character who very much resembles myself in a time that very much resembles the present, or rather begins in 2012, as any book should, on a dark and stormy night when Hurricane Sandy was bearing down on New York City and flooded a number of art galleries on the city's west side, including one that was owned at the time by my partner, Jane, who is the character Nina in the book, and her partner, Janine, who is the character Danielle in the book. And this is significant because it happened at a time in my career as an artist when I was trying to think about what came next. And I was looking a lot at the artists who were older than me, who had sort of a generation ahead. And it was clear to me that the ones who were thriving were the ones who had done something to fundamentally change their practice. And it was with that on my mind that I spent several months, along with many other people, helping to drag all this work out of the basement of a gallery. And I was really struck by what an awkward way sculpture is to communicate with the world, to make these big cumbersome things that are hard to move around. And I was interested in doing something that could move in a way that was less encumbered. And I think that sort of planted the seed for writing. And a lot of the work that I was making in the sort of years leading up to this, Kulapat asked me to show some work specifically, was sort of dealing with the interaction of bodies and buildings. This is an older piece. These were sort of pieces that happened leading up to the hurricane, and then some pieces that were actually begun while I was writing the book. And they were sort of always thinking about the awkwardness of the interaction between organic bodies and sort of rigid architectural structures. And with that in mind, the book really began as an investigation of sick building syndrome, which, like Yamasaki, is something that I felt was really inadequately addressed in my architectural education, and something that was very interesting to me, particularly in relationship to my own work. And I started to research sick building syndrome, and that, in a very circuitous way, led me back to Yamasaki, who struggled with chronic illness his entire life, and his own relationship to his body really informed many of the buildings that he was working on. And it was at this point in the process, maybe 2 years into writing a book, where I was quite proud of myself for having put my finger on this story, the story of Yamasaki that hadn't been told in English for over 40 years. And until a friend of mine called me and quite gingerly told me that somebody else was writing a book about Yamasaki, and they were several years ahead of me. I sort of went into a bit of a tailspin for a week, until I realized, I had the perspective to realize it was one of those rare moments when a project really tells you what it wants to be, and that wasn't the book that I wanted to write. I didn't want to write a kind of comprehensive retrospective of Yamasaki's life. I wanted to let other things in and to tell a kind of more personal story, and a story that was informed by the things that were going on around me. One of the things that was going on around me was this building, which this is a rendering of 432 Park Avenue, that was presented to the public around the time I started writing. This is the building itself, IRL, photographed later, around the time that I finished the book. So this building becomes a character that's sort of measuring time in the 5 years that the book takes place, and becomes an important marker of kind of where New York is now. I also was thinking a lot at the time about the idea of the architect, the archetype of the architect in literature and in cinema. One of the things that I was very focused on was the fact that I wanted to write the book about architecture that I had never read. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I think I came to realize as I was working on this project that it meant something more personal. Architecture, there's a lot of books about architecture. They tend to be quite impersonal. I don't know what exactly this means. It might mean something about architects. I think it's related to the fact that lots of architects like to photograph their buildings without people in them, which is a sort of a strange thing, because my relationship with architecture has always been very personal. And for that reason, I think the architectural stories that I've always gravitated to came more from this realm of literature, from James Salter and Donald Barthelme and Teju Cole, than from architects. And so that became an important part of the story. Another key piece of the story, strange as it may sound, is migraine. And I was writing the book during a time in my life when I was trying to understand my partner Jane's struggle with chronic migraine. And I realized, as the further I got into this project, that research had really helped me understand the built environment in a way that I'd never had before. And it also helped me understand Yamasaki's work in a way that I'd never had before. And I'd like to show this slide because this is a diagram that's in Oliver Sacks's book, Migraine, that I think he intended to be very clear, as a sort of demonstration of two things happening on axes, but to me was just obviously an architectural plan. And that was sort of recognizing that weird slip in this diagram that kind of helped me understand the role of migraine. And so that became another subject that entered into the book, as did pharmaceutical architecture. This is some Alvaro Siza buildings on the Novartis campus. And the final piece I wanted to talk about was trying to write like an artist and trying to not write like a journalist or a biographer or historian, because I'm not. And that involved a lot of looking at other artists and how artists had looked at my subjects, particularly the World Trade Center. And so I thought, in sort of deference to the context here, I would run through some of those images as well. These are two Peter Hujar photographs from 1976 of the World Trade Center. This is an image on the left by Pierre Defonil and on the right by André Kertész. Some of you will recognize that as the cover of Don DeLillo's book, Underworld. DeLillo is sort of the great narrator of the World Trade Center. It's a character in at least 3 books. The image on the right here is Gordon Matta Clark, who was himself a twin and quite obsessed with the World Trade Center. And a piece from Taishing Sei's one-year performance. The image on the left here is from a beautiful series of photographs by Baldwin Lee of the World Trade Center, and a very similar perspective from Thomas Struth. And this, of course, is one of the great images of the World Trade Center, is an installation shot of Agnes Dennis's wheat field on the swath of land that is now Battery Park City. And there are many other artist interventions much later, Gelatin, Michael Richards, Isa Genskin, but these are just a few. And the final 2 images I was going to show before we start talking are these this pair of really incredible images of that same swath of land that is now Battery Park City, that sort of lay empty and covered in sand from 1977 to about 1983, which is when this photograph was taken, of this couple sitting at the foot of the World Trade Center. And then, of course, the photograph that's on the cover of the book, which is from the first summer of 1977, just as the city is beginning to emerge from bankruptcy. And this couple is sitting on this expanse of 92 acres of sand at the foot of the World Trade Center at a time when New York is really changing in a fundamental way. That, I think, will set the stage, and if Kulapat will join me now, we can get into it. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. I always admire Justin for his tightrope walking between art and architecture, in some way always condemning architecture to the curse of the execution, at the same time the curiosity towards the practice. Right, and so when I heard about this, I think we ran into each other, and you were curious about that, and as the project unfolded. And one thing, of course, for me as an immigrant architect here, I identify quite a bit with him, and with many other, Asian architects after him, like I.M. Pei, and many others. And of course, I mean, in this case, Yama is, he's American, full American, grew up in Seattle, but then go through this whole, in the beginning, he was high because he was the one who just can deliver everything on budget and on time.
Yeah.
With a style, right? And I think then he started to kind of really denounced the pure modernism and started to kind of put somewhat decoration or something of the new formalism as it was told. So I'm just curious about someone like, but I know your work from before, and your work have this weird tension and power of body and form and experience and almost an abstract experience. Why are you interested in this fiction? Why is this figure the right center of your story?
Well, it's a good question. I think that my interest in Yamasaki has always been the fact that I didn't know who he was, right? And that I sort of had this very rigorous architectural education. I moved to New York City. I found myself living 2 blocks away from these buildings, which were the 2 of the most spectacular things I've ever seen. Maybe more successful as sculpture than they were as architecture, but they were incredible. And I remember standing there that summer and just thinking, like, how is it that I don't know who designed these buildings? Maybe it was Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, I don't know, but I had no idea. And so he'd always been sort of planted in my mind for that reason. One of these figures, like Paul Williams, who just had completely escaped my architectural education. But it wasn't until 20 years later when I started thinking about this book and I started getting back into his story that I realized how much it had in common with these other things I was interested in. His constant struggle with to sort of communicate what he wanted to say in his work, and his willingness to embrace failure. I mean, that's one of the things that I think was so interesting about his career. Is that I don't want to continue to talk shit about architects, but you're not, as a group, not known for your humility, and Yama was rare in that he really, he knew when he did something that was good, and he also knew when he did something that didn't work, and he was constantly pushing and pushing and pushing, and I just was so drawn into his story. Both, I mean, there's also these parts of the story that are just part of a life that is so incredible as a first-generation Japanese immigrant who grew up in Seattle, moved to New York, married his wife on the Friday night before Pearl Harbor, found himself immediately working for the U.S. government on a naval base in upstate New York for a government that considered the rest of his family enemy combatants, and he had to try and help his parents come to New York to avoid being sent to internment camps, and that sort of struggle that followed him for the remainder of his life, really. And so I was first interested in the work, and then I was really drawn into his personal life and his story, and felt like it was a story that needed to be told.
Well, I also find it, fascinating as someone who follow your work for many years, that this is maybe the most personal work that you have done. I mean, comparing to your sculptures and others that, in somewhat balance between the syntax and the semantics of what objects are, the tension, the last show that you do at Hannah's gallery with the touch aspect. So why the intertwining of stories, which somewhat. To be honest, sometimes I feel like, is it a forced situation that you switch between the story of Yama and then your own story in New York in 2012? So what are you trying to do that lead on to the climax of architecture in general?
No, totally. I mean, I think it was it was sort of a long journey to get there, and I think you're absolutely right. It's by far the most personal thing I've ever made, which I think was long overdue. But I realized as I was writing it, and partly related to what I was describing before about this moment of realizing that this other person was writing this book, and that could either be a disaster or it could be the moment where this project kind of told me what it wanted to be. And I was very reluctant to include so much of myself, right? I mean, I don't at any point hope to compare myself to this incredible, phenomenal, prolific career. It was more just that I needed to tell the story of Yamasaki from my perspective, and that I wasn't trying to write the sort of comprehensive biography. I was just trying to say what it meant to me, and a lot of that had to do with undoing my own education, my own architectural education, and bringing to bear the things that I had learned as working as a sculptor or curating shows, as you refer to, and that this was a project that really kind of grew out of that practice. And I don't think of it, I think a lot of people are like, whoa, this is a really radical move to go over here and start writing. And for me, it was it kind of grew out of what I was doing already. It was just the next step, and it was, I still went to the same studio. I still sat in the same room. I was just writing something instead of making something. But I think that, I'm not a biographer. I wouldn't be the best person to write a biography of Yamasaki. I'm not an architectural historian. I could only offer this weird
But
personal thing.
did you do justice to the subject? Meaning that, of course, as a biographer, you have to talk to, let's say, the family or the people that
Yeah.
work with him and all of that. In this case, you put yourself. This is an artwork, in my opinion, right? This
Yeah.
is not a biography piece. So, but at the same time, there's a subject that a lot of people might also read this as a biography, even though you didn't intend it to be, and it's
Sure.
actually very easy to read. It's a wonderful story about it, but I almost feel that the subject is actually architecture itself and not Yamasaki by himself. And I know that you spend time looking through the archives and things, but I'm also curious, like, do you talk to anyone? Do you work with him? What about the family members who exist? And how do you pitch together this collage to try to construct the image of the man behind the buildings?
Right. I did, through the process of writing this book, I became quite good friends with his granddaughter, Katie, and which happened really by chance. I approached the project as, I wanted it to be as rigorous as a real document, a real biography would be, and I did all the research I could, but I also wanted to allow these other things to, I wanted to, my own experience of the buildings to inform that book as well. So I went to go see them all, and then through this sort of quite unexpected set of circumstances, I came to meet Katie, and we became very good friends. And so the sort of the process kind of naturally led me to the family, and she was my contact with the family. And I think, the reception among the Yamasaki family has been really wonderful. They've been very supportive, which means the world to me. But and I think hope means that it was successful as a biography. But it was, it just sort of happened naturally.
Well, I think, I mean, we talked briefly before about how, and you're not the first artist to point out what a weird profession is architect, right? I mean, a lot of my artist friends, like, one went as far as like, how would any smart person want to be an architect? You dream something up, you immediately get compromised from day one, and you completely have to sell this vision for a living, for someone to actually pay for it, and you're actually not in control at all of its execution. What kind of smart artist would want to do that?
Right.
And it's really when they put that, when it's like, you're right. But there must be other reasons why this profession, which is, second oldest profession, I was told, continue, right? So so after you wrote this book, has your understanding changed? Have your appreciation or understanding or perception of the profession changed?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it doesn't make, being an artist is a complicated profession as well, right? And I think, Vito Acconci began as a writer, and then he started making art because he just said it was so much fucking easier, right? And then he became an architect. So, none of these professions are fun, right? Nothing in the world, nothing is more painful than writing, but, or at least for me. But, as Claudia said, perhaps by accident, I could have been an architect. And I've always been fascinated by the sort of idea of the architect. And I think, what I was sort of singularly focused on in this book is that archetype, because it is a very specific archetype. It hangs like a shadow over everyone who practices architecture. And so I was reading every book that I could that has an architect as a character. I watched every film. I think I did actually watch every major film that has an architect as a character. They're not a lot, and it's a such a narrow archetype. And it's just fascinating how it's hard to imagine another profession where that character has such an influence on the actual practice. So I don't know if I learned more about what real architects actually do, but I learned more about the sort of fictitious idea of
What
you
what
guys
if
do.
one of your children want to become an architect? What would you be okay with that, or?
I mean, I of course I'd be okay with it. I think it's very unlikely to happen. Katie Yamasaki would always go to to Yama's office, and apparently all of the people who worked for him would be like, "Do you want to be an architect when you grow up?" And she's like, "But it's Sunday." And you're all here, So yeah, no, I love. I mean, I could have been an architect, and I have tremendous respect for architects. And I think you're right to point out that I poke the tiger a bit, but
No, but it's really true. I was especially looking from the artist's perspective,
Yeah.
right? And I think, in a way, I have certain respect for Yamasaki too. When you look at Century City, it's still one of the best tall buildings we have in Los Angeles. When you think about how they relate to each other, the triangle and the hotels and all the whole thing aspect of that. And, his repetition in a way was diluted because, a lot of the hardcore modernism look as his work as somewhat decorative and not as powerful as the others because, of course, they're coming off from Mies van der Rohe and something very strong. So, in a way, Yuri kind of repositioned himself. He's kind of a humanist, but he's a humanist for the developer, right? So therefore, it's very difficult for him to say, "I'm all about the warm and the fuzzy," but by the way, I just built, Pruitt Igor, which is very difficult for him to say all the
Sure.
what he's taught
Yeah.
about serenity and calm and warm and things. But by reading your book, it feel like the intention was there, and I didn't know. I mean, I didn't read the book before, the story before that. A lot of things on the housing project was so compromised, to the point that when I read the book again, I was like, this is like Howard Rourke. I mean, if Howard Rourke happened, he would burn the whole thing down
Right.
rather than let someone carry his name and continue to be condemned forever. But Yamasaki, in that sense, kind of moved on. And of course, the whole thing was demolished as the biggest failure of modern housing and modern architecture. And it cursed him ever since, right, as the architect for that. So I wonder about that, as in like, if we kind of stand back from it and look at his work, what he's trying to do, he's trying to humanize modern architecture, all of this growth from post-war slabs building, office building, terminals, and embassies and things. Do you think he did a good job in balancing that, schedule and budget on one side, getting the business people to be happy that he can deliver things on time and on budget, but at the same time is talking about serenity, talking about quality of life that could happen in more. When I read, I believe that he actually believe in it.
Yes.
But the execution part, there's a gap there.
Totally. Did he do a good job? It's a very complicated question. I think that's part of what is so interesting about this story. For those of you who don't know the story of Pruitt Igoe, it was one of the first major housing projects that was built with funding from the Housing Authority in the early 1950s, and it was based on the sort of model of high-rise housing in New York, which was quite successful because there was density there. The real failure Yamasaki could tell as the project was going along, he was getting squeezed on every decision. The buildings went from being mixed height to 33 buildings, 11 stories tall. He knew that it was compromised.
Like the
before it was
windows are
finished.
smaller,
Every
the
detail of it.
railings, the landscape, everything.
Right,
Yeah.
but the real undoing of that project was the fact that everyone had anticipated the population of St. Louis to rise after the war, and it didn't. And it's what's so interesting about Pruitt Igoe as a cautionary tale, I think, is that as an architect, you can have the best intentions and you can release something into the world, and there are forces that are beyond your control. And what's so interesting about Pruitt-Igoe is that it was subject to these hugely important generational shifts in the United States, right? I mean, it was about white flight. It was about the Great Migration. It was about Brown versus Board of Education. It was about the changing demographic of the entire country. And the burden of all of that fell on the residents of Pruitt-Igoe in a way that's still being untangled. I mean, this thing that I mentioned in the book that I discovered kind of late in the game is that after the Nixon administration decided to blow up these buildings, the few remaining residents that were still at Pruitt-Igoe in the late 70s, the ones with the fewest resources, were given housing vouchers by the St. Louis Housing Authority to move to one suburb of St. Louis, and that was Ferguson, right? And so that's the repercussions are still being felt. And there's this incredible journalist, Sylvester Brown, who grew up in Pruitt-Igoe and wrote about the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And he talks about how no matter how you look at it, the sort of fuse that led to that summer in Ferguson was lit, in this development decades before. And I think that there's something so powerful about that story and the story of the World Trade Center, which is equally complex. And, it's just this spectacular misfortune of the fact that this one man happened to design these two buildings that met this spectacular demise that sort of became symbolic of these huge shifts in American architecture. But does that mean he was unsuccessful? No, I mean, I would say there are many buildings where he was totally successful at the same time. It's just his because of those two failures, he's kind of been erased from history. And so what I'm trying to do is to sort of unpack that a little bit,
Well, the way you wrote the book felt like you're writing for a television series.
Oh, here we go.
It did. It was like, okay, well, the way you explain the experience, the movement, is that your new gig?
You tell me. I give you a manuscript if you want to shop it around a
there's
bit.
a whole character involved, all the diversity stories, there's explosion involved in, every episode.
There's lots of explosions, yeah.
Yeah, so
The
recent history, train wreck, all of that.
Yeah, climate change. There's been a lot of interest in a documentary about Yamasaki, which I would love to happen. I would love to be involved in that in some capacity. I'm not the person to do it. And you've mentioned this to me before. It's interesting that you see it as something so visual. I don't see the TV show, but if you do, we can talk about it more.
Exactly.
I think what you're talking about is the fact that I'm not. I have some insecurity as a writer, but I know my core competency as a writer, because I'm a visual person, is I can really describe what I'm looking at. Like, I can't write great dialogue. I don't really understand the intricacies of plot, but I can write about what I'm looking at, and I think that's what you're picking up on.
I think so, but I think going back to your work, which I asked whether you show some of the work that you made during the writing of the book, just to really understand the other side of your practice, right? Which the book took 5 years to be completed. There's this weird tension of again the abject, the semantic, the specific things, like when you deal with gravity, you deal with touch, you deal with decay, you deal with all of these, but there's also a very clear syntax of structure of material, steel, glass, chains, and things like that. And so I wonder about that, because of course that's in your background of architecture education. And I think, and maybe that's why I'm also kind of attracted to your work, because it has an architectural language that I can read into it.
Sure.
Right, because maybe that's why you're maybe more focused on sculpture more than other art form, because it was kind of the three-dimensional exercise of things. So with that, I'm just curious about this. Again, I'm not trying to dwell on the film opportunities, but film and architecture are very close.
Yeah.
Right, and how the storytelling and how when you write in the book, how you talk about experience of the flood or the experience of things happening, people, the experience part is undeniable. It's always about from someone's perspective going to some place, right? But when I feel about your work as, as an artist, I see that more from your perspective rather than from the visitor perspective. I don't
Okay.
see that you're actually doing the work for other people to experience except yourself. So I wasn't quite sure with the book because it's a storytelling, whereas
Yeah.
an artwork exists without people. So do you approach the artwork in the same way, that from your way of looking or from other people looking at it?
Yeah, it's funny. I think that my first thought here is how uncomfortable it was for me to write in the first person, and that actually I didn't until the very end. And most of the parts of the book that are about me, I wrote in the third person because that was the only way I could get it out. And then at the very end, I would go in and just change it over to the first person and sort of cringe at myself as I did it. So it was, that, and then that's a bit maybe just some sort of old Yankee repression, but trying to kind of, get myself comfortable in that mode, and of like kind of learning how to write that way. But also just to sort of, the other thing I think you're talking about here is just kind of cutting things together, right? And that is both what experience is like, and it's also the part of the book that is maybe somewhat cinematic. And so when I first started working on this, because I really didn't know what I was doing, I reached out to people friends of friends who had in the literary world, and the advice I kept getting was like, you're writing a collection of essays. People are into collections of essays right now, and that's what you're doing. And I was like, people are into collections of essays that have already been published in the New Yorker, but it's not what I'm doing. And there was this big push from the people I was talking to take it in that direction. And the one kind of place where I felt like I really knew what I wanted was that I knew that all these things had to go together, and it was about how they all like cut together. And because that's sort of about, it's about how you experience architecture. It's not like it's a temporal thing. It's about kind of the sequence, looking at a thing and then looking at it again, looking at it 2 weeks later. It's not a fixed thing. And so I don't feel like I'm answering your question, but that's my reaction to your question.
Well, thank you. I think that's suffice, I guess. Yes. So, well, I mean, I'm curious to see, because it seems like a reflection moment. You went through this book with COVID as well, quarantining, refining the book, publishing, working with your editors and things like it come out just in time when everyone's ready to, go out, and we have our public program right now. I wonder how you think about your practice now. I think, again, it's, as a friend more than anything, I'm just curious because it seems like you're unpack something in your life as well. I think it's biography, but it's also kind of autobiographical for you within your time in New York, and now
Sure.
You're back in LA, where you've been here many years before. So how do you see this unpacking of writing, architecture, art, possibly film in
Right.
your trajectory as an artist?
I mean, I like to think that in time it will all appear to be a very smooth kind of curve, and that I'm sort of looking around trying to figure out how to say what I want to say, and that the mode in which that happens changes with time. So the hardest question is kind of the what's next question, and I think that I am working on another book. There's also a part of me that's like, what if it doesn't want to be a book? What if it wants to be something different? So I'm trying to let that still be a kind of an intuitive practice, because as I said before, it's not, nothing in my day to day has really changed. I still get up and I go to the same studio and I sit at this little desk in an awkwardly large room that was designed for making sculpture, and I kind of continue to do the same thing every day. So I think of it as a very continuous line, although it doesn't probably look like that from the outside. So I'm not entirely sure what's next. Yeah.
Well, last question before maybe we open this to, I mean, our friends here, which I'm sure have a lot of questions for you as well. I think there's, you know, what is seem to be what everyone's interested now is this research-driven art process, right? And I think your work as a sculpture have always been that. You have reference, you have many other things that related to the work you make. Of course, this book is another level of research that you
Right.
have to do that go into this, and so all of that. So, how important is research to the creation of an artwork? In your case,
Uh, Incredibly important. I mean, I think that's sort of I think the chance of research, right? The way that research leads you down one road and then to another and another is like the sort of is very generative for me, right? That's like
is
where
it framing the question or is it feeling the answer?
it's both, right? It's just following the lead. There's always this kind of research is this sort of goose chase, right? That it kind of leads you to different directions and different things kind of come together from that. And whether you're researching for a sculpture that's just going to be a bunch of stuff, or if you write a book that's a bunch of words, it's the same kind of process. I think it's a very so it's sort of how I generate ideas, research. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, questions from the audience, I guess, our friends. Michael Webb.
Can I take my mask off to speak?
With the microphone, oh, there's a microphone behind you.
I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book yet. I'm looking forward to that. But I'm curious whether, as an artist, you were struck by the irony of your art being carefully exhibited, protected in climate-controlled rooms, properly lit, and yet you could sweep it away with a single gesture. Where architecture, buildings are monumental, impervious against almost everything except high explosive. And yet they are squandered and discarded almost like used Kleenex all the time. I mean, just this past few weeks, the destruction of an early Louis Kahn building, a major house by Marcel Breuer. Even without terrorists, even without, Nixon wanting a showpiece, to demonstrate the futility of government funding of paternalism in housing. Architecture is so incredibly vulnerable, and buildings have such often short life. They
Yeah.
may be designed for the ages, but they really are constantly at risk.
You're right. I mean, I totally agree, and I think that there is. I mean, I would add a third component to that, which is the experience of writing, right? Because then you get this other thing that just floats around, and is sort of worthless as an object in and of itself, but kind of still has this power to move through the world. I think that. I think what you're speaking to is sort of a cultural condition of this moment, which is that I think art may be overvalued, and I think architecture may be undervalued right now. And just as an example, I've been working on projects with both the Paul Rudolph Foundation and the Charles Jenks Foundation recently, and it's amazing to me, these foundations of these great architects, that they're just broke because the buildings that exist in the world don't have any way of generating income, whereas artist foundations, they have art, they can sell them, they can, and I think that there's a the what you're really keying in on is just that we don't value architecture culturally, and I think that there's a lot that has to happen to kind of change that, and we don't also consider it in the same way. I think that, especially in the last 5 years, as we've been thinking a lot more about who is making the art or the film or the television or the music that we're consuming, where is that conversation about who's making the buildings that people go to work in or go to school in or go to live in? In the vast majority of the time, people have no choice about the architecture that they occupy. But yet there's not this conversation about where that content is being developed at nearly the same level that it's in other art forms. So I think you're there's a lot there, and whether it's ironic or tragic or a bit of both is a larger question. Yeah.
My name is Jonathan Evans, and I did read your book, and I have to say it was really an amazing read, and I don't know how you put it all together, and it flowed in a way that made so much information very comfortable to digest. But I wondered when I was reading it if how many times you actually shuffled, or how the sequencing of the parts went together, because I couldn't think that I would change anything, but I wondered if it was just the overall immersive quality of the writing, or if in fact there was a narrative flow that made it a kind of compelling read.
Yeah, no, I just nailed it the first time. No, thank you for reading it. Hundreds and hundreds of times, and I've alluded already to the fact that this book was written in a quite a large space, and it looked like the sort of office of the detective trying to solve the serial killer murder. I'm a very visual person. I was trained in architecture school to pin things up on the wall, and so. There are people here who are close enough to me to attest to the fact that there were like hundreds of these drafts. I would print different subject matters out on different color pieces of paper, and then just spend like days moving them around. So it really it was it was maybe the hardest part, was kind of getting all these things to fit together in the right way. I knew that it was possible, but it was a huge amount of work. Yeah. But it did at the end. Finally, I imagine. People have this experience of editing films or something. It did kind of click, like it started at the very end to kind of click together in a way that felt right. Yeah.
Did MIT assign an editor for you, or you just self?
Yes. Oh God, no. And I should. Yeah. I worked incredibly closely with my editor Tom Weaver, who I actually met for the first time in December because of COVID. We were never in the same country. During the entire process, but we worked a lot. He was very generous to me with his time and kind of working through different versions of how it all fit together.
Thank you so much for being here. It's great to sort of hear more about this process. And I wanted to maybe triangulate a little bit and ask about the Vignoli tower, and sort of if it's sort of a binary between you and Yama, how this other figure begins to come in, especially as we're talking about the value of architecture. And this is a very high value piece of architecture.
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. We haven't talked about that very much. But, as I alluded to before, it was sort of, it just became this thing. It was happening while I was writing. It presented itself as a rendering, and then it took about 5 years to come to life as I was writing the book. So I was just kind of clocking it as I moved through New York City. What I think, and there are these funny things, the connections to the World Trade Center. It's a building that's square in plan, which is actually quite unusual, 4 identical facades. And it was the tallest building in New York when it was finished. And I think that the way that I talk about it in the book, which I think is sort of became the core kind of meaning of it, was this very dumb way of thinking about what the tallest building in New York means as an index of where power resides at a given time. So that you could imagine that at one time being a temporary Lenape hunting shelter that was then displaced by a Dutch fort, sort of military infrastructure. Then that was surpassed by churches, steeples, eventually Trinity, Collegiate, which remained the tallest buildings for a very long time. Commerce builds the Woolworth, the Singer, Chrysler, eventually the Empire State Building. The World Trade Center represents this weird collusion of private and public, which again, remained the tallest building until 2011 or 2001, and now the tallest buildings are these incredibly slender private towers that are really kind of containers for private wealth, and the city doesn't really want them to be there. There's this amazing moment that I write about where both the New York Mets and the New York Fire Department have to hold special meetings to be like, wait a second, our logo is the skyline, but do we have to change the skyline to put these buildings in? And I think the fact that neither of them did suggests a lot about how the city views these buildings. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, it was there. I wrote about it because it was what was happening in the city as I was writing, but I also think it's a useful kind of link to buildings in the past.
You've mentioned some architectural failures, the general lack of a cultural conversation about architecture, and I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts, if you have any, around to what extent this plays into what I at least perceive as a low tolerance for what I would call adventurous big architecture in this country. So, for example, when I go to Bangkok or Singapore or London, lots of other places, I don't see the level of tolerance for that kind of architecture, that kind of experimental architecture in a big way in this country. And I'm just wondering what you think accounts for that.
No, it's a great question. I'm going to ask the practitioner. What do you think accounts for that?
Well, I think, architecture suffer the understanding of it for the longest time, right? I think right now people consume architecture through media, so therefore it is a photograph, it is a rendering. So, but if you compare architecture to, which I normally do, to fashion or to food, you cannot judge a food by the photograph of the food or even the recipe. So therefore, architecture is now competing with sculpture and paintings on that platform of visual pleasure. And so, I think those of us that, I agree with you, but at the same time, as we say, or, as Frank Israel and many other architects said, you are as good as your client. So therefore, if the whole community didn't come up, I remember talking to Yoito, you mentioned Bangkok, which is one of the Toyoto's favorite cities in the world, and that's why we spent a lot of time together. And we talked about that, and he said, yeah, there's a lot of talents in Thailand, but it's going to take 30 years for this to come up. And I was like, why? Because he said, because the society is not ready. And it's very true, because it's not something you can just sit in a big room and paint, and somehow globally someone would do it. You write a recipe and hope someone will pay you to cook that dish for them. So it has an ingrained quality to it. And, I'm going to kind of challenge you in the sense, I think that sometimes architecture is doing experimental for the wrong reason. We're trying to be sculptural. We're trying to we define gravity, look at cantilever, look at all of these things, which make things sexy and unusual. But it really doesn't touch the impact, the power of architecture it has on a human level, on a social level. We don't do that because it can't really convey easily. But when you're in the presence of great architecture, you understand why it exists. You understand why it matters, right? And so that is kind of old and classic, but also need to be retold in a different way. So I think that's missing. Like, for example, in the book, one thing that Justin mentioned, which I think is maybe the best things in my book about Yamasaki, is he talked a lot about negative spaces. He talked a lot about why the prudent Icor towers cannot be the same height. Right. It have to be 6th floor, 12th floor. So the diversity, there's going to be connection to the ground. Even when he talked about the World Trade Center, he doesn't even talk about the tower. He talked about the space around it, right? Or if you go to Central City, that negative space that those triangle towers create with the thing is the best. It's almost like Roman. So I think the negative space is what we kind of occupy, but it's not sexy at all. and because of that, it's forgotten. So for me, as an architect, I feel like how do we talk about that and without turning into, Martha Stewart living, right? So how do we talk about essence without being non-edgy? I think that's the
Yeah.
part that's kind of the dilemma of our practice today.
I also think there's like a, we're not good at learning from our mistakes, and I think I like to use the example of Hudson Yards in New York right now. Like if I, you know, so Hudson Yards is a situation where the city made a terrible deal with the developer. They built millions of square feet of office space that the city didn't need. They built a giant open plaza at an inhuman scale with direct exposure to the wind coming off the Hudson River. These are all mistakes that were made in the World Trade Center. Like, exactly, spot on. If somebody had bothered to think about this other massive project that had happened just, on further south on the same island, they wouldn't have repeated these same mistakes. And it's, it's really striking. I got my first shot at the Javits Center, which is one of the all-time great New York buildings. And I came out and it sort of merged to pandemic Hudson Yards. And you're just standing there in this like wasteland. And you're like, they did every single thing that the World Trade Center did wrong, and none of the things that the World Trade Center did right. And so I think there is sort of a lack of sophistication in our thinking about what's come before, too. That also kind of adds to what Kulapat's describing.
Hi. Hi, Justin.
Hi.
I've thought a lot about this book, and we've talked about it, but I wanted to actually piggyback on something Kulapat said, which is about experimentation. Rather than thinking about these two buildings, particularly Pruitt-Igoe and the World Trade Center, as failures, I think of them as great successes because of the experimentation. I mean, I would add Century City to that, and others of his career. But I think it's not the spectacular failure of the buildings, but it's a spectacular success, to me, of the degree to which he experimented with space. And some of it didn't come off right, of course, but this is what advanced a lot of the conversation about housing and low-rise, high-rise, and extremity, and the way people used and failed to use space, and the way we didn't understand that, we, the government, architects, developers, etc. So I think the success for him was a willingness to experiment, and the buildings failed. And I think that's a nuance. It's a tiny nuance, but I think it's really, really important. Then these buildings were failures for me, right, in understanding his practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky one because so much of that experimentation was then sort of muffled by the bureaucracy for whom he was working. But there are things about the World Trade Center in particular that are truly extraordinary from an engineering point of view, and continue to be sort of unparalleled. But yeah.
No, I think you have a great point. And, within his career, I mean, of course, you read from the book to that, the reason why he was selected for the World Trade Center is because they know they can work with him. He's not
right.
an ego kind of prima donna that's going to make life difficult for the Port Authority or the developers. He know how to respect the business model and all of that, but he also stretched the envelope by creating something maybe a little bit more interesting than the corporate office building type, including the housing as well. So he kind of go in with this somewhat balanced but compromised position from day one. Even the housing project too. I mean, if he go in as a Howard Rogue or a Zaha Hadid, if he got selected, he'll get his way to go through it. And maybe we have a different story for these projects. But he go in being a nice guy, from Seattle, based in Detroit, know how to respect business decisions, know how things work with the politicians, but to bring in, the quality of architecture that he thinks is needed within that time. So he was hated by both. I mean, he was hated by Ada Lewis, who was like completely like article about how you know,
Well, she hung on for a long time. It was at the very end. Yeah.
yeah. So in a way, I mean, on that front, I kind of celebrate him for trying to make it work, right? Because of course you can, be a hermit and create these beautiful pavilions and, hoping the Pritzker will come. And then your other side is like, okay, well, I work with developers. I work with these business people who have impact on our cities. How do I bring them a little bit better than what they were? So I think the line is quite interesting in a way that, like what you say, it is a successful failure because and your book shed light on these, which I didn't know that there were so many value engineerings and compromises
Sure.
on these projects to the point that he just could not even stand it.
Right, but then they're also great. There's like the Rainier Tower, which is still there, which is an insane building and was very criticized at the time, but now looks incredible.
Thank you for this talk. I had a question. It's kind of minor, but I've long been curious. He uses like a medieval arch that's then tightened. That's in the trade centers, I think in the top of Rainier, Minneapolis, Princeton.
Yeah.
Do you know why he did that and what its significance was?
Yeah, well, that form first emerges in the Duran airport. So it was kind of this idea of trying to synthesize. It was right after he'd returned from this trip to specifically to India, which was very informative. And he was looking a lot at the Mughal architecture in Fatehpur Sikri and the Taj Mahal, which of course was like the ultimate anathema to anybody practicing modernism at that time. But then it kind of all came together in the Duran airport, where he was trying to sort of consciously blend sort of modernist imagery with Islamic tracery. And that's for the first time you see that lancet arch, which is, generally referred to as Gothic, but of course has this sort of original origins in Islamic architecture. And so it's around as a motif in his work. The most extreme versions are at Princeton and Minneapolis, as you refer to, where you get these kind of weird, like elongated things. But the funny thing about the Princeton building is that there's this moment in the staircase on the inside of Robertson where he's like figuring out the railings, and he's trying to resolve this detail where 3 railings come down and how they all join. And you can see that he figures out this little these 3 lines become one arch. And that's how he ultimately resolves where the facade of the World Trade Center meets the ground. And I'm just going to tell a bit of a story because we didn't hit on it before. But Yamasaki was terribly afraid of heights, and he felt really uncomfortable above 7 stories. And so, talking about irony, he's finds himself in the position of building the 2 tallest buildings in the world, and he decides that the way to make it comfortable for himself or for anyone else who is afraid of heights is to allow the width of his own shoulders to determine the fenestration of the facade. He was not a large man, about 22 inches from shoulder to shoulder, and so that becomes the governing module of the facade of the World Trade Center, which is totally hard to believe. And for anyone who's ever been in that building, what was so crazy about it is you would be up on the 90th floor looking out over New York City, and you felt like you could have been in like a DMV in Yonkers. You didn't feel like you were on top of the world until you were up in the restaurant, which had bigger windows. And so he has this 22-inch module that's coming down, 1,400 feet down to this plaza, and has to do something to just allow people in at the plaza level. And so that you can see how he took this railing in Princeton and was like, that's the moment where I can take these 3, I can turn 22 into 66 and have a proper entryway.
I'm very concerned that you're going to turn into an architecture historian.
I know that really sounded like an architectural historian.
I'm
Sorry.
very concerned about this.
We can cut that out later. Yeah.
No, but it's a good point. But as one of the things that the book also shed light on is that he was among that generation, right? Edward Durrell Stone and many other who really got at the beginning of POMO coming out, started kind of post-war, rejecting this kind of towers. The Seagram building was built in 1959. That's the pantheon of the commerce world. Now we're going to do something else. So it was a kind of this push towards something more humanistic and more human scale with natural materials and things like that. I think within that, he definitely represents kind of a clear solution because of his success of all these buildings. But it's interesting that you touch on all of these human elements, his
Yeah.
stories that allowed his character to shine. Ready for Netflix. Any questions?
There's one in the middle there.
Yes.
I mean, you said that in your research, in your preparation for writing your book, you were able to synthesize a lot of pieces of other architecture narratives and narratives of architects. I'm wondering your thoughts on where Yamasaki fits into the larger yet very narrow kind of architect narrative that has already been put forth, and the ways in which you constructed his character to fit that mold or to break that mold.
Right. Well, I mean, I didn't. I tried to construct as little as possible. I mean, the simple answer to that question is that there is this very narrow archetype of this. He fits in it because it's a tragic archetype. He doesn't fit in it because it's always a 6'5" white man. Right, and so that's the simplest way of answering the question. I think the thing that's so incredible about the architectural kind of archetype, such as it is this unbelievably homogenous little thing. I think I watched every film, as I said, that has major film that has an architect as a primary character, and everyone looks exactly the same except for Wesley Snipes in Jungle Fever and Eiji Okada in Hiroshima Mon Amour. Who actually looks a lot like Yama, both very handsome. But so I think that he, that's the sort of tension, the tension that I think animates a lot of the story is that he does have these kind of Howard Rourke characters, for lack of a better word, and in his integrity and his determination, his conviction. But he also was working in architecture at a time when it was. He was very much an outsider, and so he didn't fit that mold at all. And you can see him trying to sort of pull away from it at times.
Yeah, one thing that I miss about the book that maybe in part 2, that his relationship with Isamu Noguchi, for example, right?
Yeah.
They're in the same boat. They grew up Japanese American in a country at war with Japan. They had to get sent to camp. They could not get a job. They were not, especially when he was working on governmental project,
Sure.
He was rejected from the site, and so
And they
there's
were
a whole,
friends. Yeah.
all
Yeah.
of that, including Isamu
Yeah.
also,
Yeah.
or many others. I work with Yoko Ono. She said the same thing. There's a lot of, it's a very complex moment in the history of America. But then also when he went to Cranbrook and have all this wonderful relationship with Nelson and many others, I feel that for me, like that's another story I would like to know more, because it seems like he's at the center of that as well. For all this artistic practice. Because
Totally,
when you look
yeah.
at his work, you see this somewhat corporate architect who doesn't seem to be within the context of cultural communications or setting. But when you look at his trajectory, he touched on all of these stones, which are set similar tone in the different disciplines.
But always very complicated. I mean, he's in Detroit. He's hanging out with Nelson and Saarinen and all those guys, but he can't live. I mean, he's totally redlined from living in Bloomfield Hills. And so he actually has to live over in Troy with Balthazar Korab. So it's always complicated by that. And the Noguchi example is a very good one, because they were friends in New York and they worked together sort of as activists at the beginning of the war. The other comparison that I think is fascinating is his relationship, which was not a good one, with I.M. Pei. And I think in a they are, I think, the sort of two most important non-white architects of that generation, perhaps in the history of this country. But there's some very stark differences between their career. that have a lot, and they both worked really closely with William Zeckendorf. They were both friends of developers, but I think that the Yama belonged to a very specific generation of Japanese Americans who didn't, he was that sort of that the Nisei group, which even Noguchi was not entirely in because he was not entirely Japanese, who didn't identify entirely as American or as Japanese, right? Even your experience working with Taro Ando, who was of this post-war generation of Japanese architects, had a very different relationship to the history and to the history of Japanese architecture, which was always a complicated one for Yamasaki. There's this amazing photograph of him sitting next to Kenzo Tange in 1960 at the Metabolist Conference, and he's just kind of like, what I want to get back to Detroit and do some work. I don't want to talk about these big ideas, So I think, it's always very complicated for him. I think this clock is ticking over here. So if there's no more questions, I think we should wrap it up, let everyone go home. Kulapat, thank you.
Thank you.